The North Sea wind, a serrated blade of cold, sliced through Owen Hawthorne's thick work jacket. He pulled his hood tighter, the rough fabric scratching against his stubble. The supply boat, a bobbing speck against the steel-gray expanse, drew closer to the rig, its horn a mournful bellow in the vastness. Routine. Another delivery of supplies, another brief connection to the world beyond this metal island. But something was different this time. As the boat nudged against the rig's flank, a figure on the deck caught Owen's eye. A boy, no older than 10, stood huddled near the railing, his thin jacket offering little protection against the biting wind. He was small, almost swallowed by the oversized orange life vest, his face pale and pinched with cold. The boy's gaze, fixed on the towering structure of the rig, held a mixture of awe and apprehension. Owen felt a strange pull towards the boy, a sudden and inexplicable urge to help. He unzipped his heavy work coat, the warmth trapped inside escaping like a sigh. The boy, startled by the movement, looked up at Owen. His eyes, a startling shade of blue against the pallid skin, held a vulnerability that resonated deep within Owen. "Here," Owen said, his voice rough from the wind. He extended the coat towards the boy, who hesitated, his gaze darting between the offered garment and Owen's face. "Take it," Owen urged, his voice softening. "You're freezing." The boy finally reached out, his small hands disappearing into the oversized sleeves. The coat engulfed him, its weight seemingly too much for his slight frame. He looked up at Owen again, a flicker of a smile touching his lips. It was a fleeting expression, quickly replaced by the same apprehension that had been there before. Owen nodded, a strange satisfaction settling in his chest. He turned back to his work, the biting wind now a sharper presence against his exposed flannel shirt. He didn't notice Grant Vance approaching until he heard his voice, tinged with a familiar edge. "What was that about, Hawthorne?" Grant asked, his eyes fixed on the boy now bundled in Owen's coat. "He was cold," Owen replied, shrugging. "Just being decent." Grant's gaze didn't waver. "Decent? You giving your coat to some stranger's kid? Seems a bit much." Owen bristled. "He's just a boy, Grant. What's the big deal?" "The big deal," Grant said slowly, his eyes narrowing, "is that we don't know who he is, where he came from, or what he's doing here." Owen dismissed Grant's words with a wave of his hand. "He came with the supply boat. He's probably someone's son tagging along for the ride." Grant grunted, his gaze still fixed on the boy. "Maybe," he said, the word hanging in the air like a veiled threat. He turned and walked away, his heavy boots clanging against the metal deck. Owen watched him go, a prickle of unease settling in his gut. He'd grown accustomed to the underlying paranoia that permeated the rig. Weeks at sea, isolated from the world, tended to breed suspicion and distrust among the crew. But Grant's reaction felt different, more pointed. It was as if he were accusing Owen of something unspoken and sinister. He glanced back at the boy, who was now talking to one of the deckhands, the coat still enveloping him like a protective shell. The boy's laughter, carried by the wind, reached Owen's ears. It was a light, carefree sound, at odds with the grim atmosphere of the rig. Owen shook his head, trying to dispel the nagging feeling of unease. He was just being kind, he told himself. He was just helping a cold kid. There was nothing more to it. Yet, the seed of doubt, planted by Grant's suspicion, had already begun to take root. The wind, whipping around the rig, seemed to whisper secrets, fueling a growing sense of paranoia that he couldn't quite shake off. The boy, the coat, the uneasy stares of the crew, they all seemed connected, part of a puzzle he couldn't yet decipher. The chill still clung to Owen, a persistent reminder of the wind's bite and the warmth he'd given away. He adjusted the straps of his diving gear, the familiar weight a small comfort in the face of the unnerving quiet that had settled over the rig. The supply boat was gone, vanished into the gray expanse of the North Sea. Owen had watched it disappear earlier that morning, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach as the vessel slipped over the horizon. He descended into the frigid water, the world above fading into a shimmering, distorted memory. The familiar pressure built against his eardrums, a dull ache that signaled his descent into the depths. He focused on the task at hand, checking the pipelines for any signs of damage. The rhythmic hiss of his breathing apparatus, the muffled clangs of his tools against the metal, were the only sounds in the watery abyss. Then he heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible over the static in his comms. He stopped, his hand hovering over a valve. He strained to hear, his heart quickening. The whisper came again, a string of unintelligible sounds, like voices carried on a distant current. "Topside, do you copy?" Owen spoke into his microphone, his voice tight. There was a pause, then the crackle of static followed by the rig superintendent's voice, calm and reassuring. "We copy, Hawthorne. Everything all right down there?" Owen hesitated. "I'm hearing something on the comms." Whispers. "Can you check the frequencies?" Another pause. "We're not picking up anything unusual, Hawthorne. Could be interference. How's the pipeline looking?" Owen frowned. He knew what he'd heard. It wasn't interference. It was something else, something unsettling. "The pipeline seems fine. I'll finish the inspection and report back." He completed the dive, the whispers of persistent presence in the back of his mind. As he ascended, the feeling of unease intensified. The world above, once a haven, now seemed tainted by the mystery of the whispers and the lingering suspicion surrounding the boy. Back on the rig, the atmosphere was thick with a tension Owen couldn't explain. The crew members moved about their duties with a quiet efficiency, their faces grim and unreadable. He tried to catch Grant Vance's eye, hoping to talk, to understand the strange hostility he'd sensed, but Grant avoided him, his gaze sliding away whenever Owen looked his way. He ate lunch alone, the whispers echoing in his thoughts, mixing with the murmurs of the other crew members. He caught snippets of their conversations, hushed tones, furtive glances, and each one seemed to reinforce the growing sense that something was being kept from him. He tried to rationalize it. The whispers were probably just equipment malfunction. Grant's avoidance was likely just his usual surliness amplified by the rig's claustrophobic environment. The boy was just a kid, and his appearance, his vulnerability, had triggered some misplaced paternal instinct in Owen. But the logic felt thin, brittle. It couldn't explain the persistent unease, the feeling of being watched, the growing certainty that he was missing something crucial, something connected to the boy in the coat. He remembered the boy's eyes, the fear and vulnerability in their depths, and a shiver ran down his spine. It was as if the boy had known something, something he couldn't articulate, something he was trying to communicate through his silence and his fear. As the day wore on, Owen's paranoia grew. He started to see meaning in every glance, every whispered word, every seemingly innocuous action. The crew's avoidance, their hushed conversations, their careful scrutiny, it all pointed to a conspiracy, a secret they were desperately trying to conceal. And he, Owen, had inadvertently stumbled upon it. He had become a threat, simply by offering a shivering boy his coat. The North Sea stretched out before him, a vast and indifferent gray canvas under a sky of matching hue. Owen stared out at the desolate expanse, his breath clouding the cold air. The supply boat was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there at all. He'd woken early that morning, drawn to the deck by a nagging sense of unease. He'd expected to see the familiar silhouette of the supply vessel against the horizon, a comforting reminder of the world beyond the rig. But there was nothing. Just the endless expanse of the sea, stretching out to meet the sky. He'd questioned the deckhands, his voice tight with a growing anxiety. Had they seen the boat leave? What time had it departed? Their answers were vague, evasive. They'd mumbled about schedules and routines, their eyes sliding away from his gaze. One had mentioned seeing the boat's lights disappearing in the pre-dawn darkness. Another claimed it had left just after first light. Their stories didn't match, their timelines contradicted each other. He'd gone to the rig superintendent, a stern, no-nonsense man named Peterson, his questions becoming more pointed, more insistent. Peterson had dismissed his concerns with a wave of his hand. The boat had left as scheduled, he'd said, his tone clipped and impatient. There was nothing unusual about it. He suggested Owen focus on his work and leave the logistics to those who knew what they were doing. But Owen couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The boat's disappearance, the crew's evasive answers, the whispers he'd heard during his dive, it all coalesced into a growing sense of dread. He remembered the boy, the fear in his eyes, the way he'd clutched the coat as if it were a lifeline. He remembered Grant Vance's suspicion, his pointed questions, the veiled threat in his words. He paced the deck, the cold wind whipping around him, mirroring the turmoil in his mind. He replayed the events of the past few days, searching for answers, for clues. He remembered the boy talking to the deckhand, his laughter echoing across the metal platform. Had he been asking for help? Had he been trying to warn him? He went back to the deckhands, pressing them for more details. He asked about the boy, about his name, about who he was with. They shrugged, their faces blank. They couldn't remember, they said. There were always people coming and going on the supply boats. It was hard to keep track. He found himself drawn to the railing, staring out at the empty sea. The boy's face swam before his eyes, his pale skin, his startling blue eyes, the oversized coat engulfing his small frame. He imagined the boy on the boat, huddled against the railing, his gaze fixed on the receding rig. Had he been scared? Had he known what was happening? He thought about the coat. His coat. The warmth he'd given away, the strange compulsion he'd felt to help the boy. Had it been a mistake? Had he inadvertently drawn attention to himself, to the boy? Had his act of kindness somehow triggered the events that followed? The questions swirled in his mind, unanswered, unresolved. The rig, once a familiar and predictable environment, now felt alien and threatening. The crew, once his colleagues, now seemed like strangers, their faces masks of indifference or veiled hostility. He felt isolated, trapped in a web of suspicion and paranoia, the empty sea a constant reminder of the missing boat and the boy who had vanished with it. The wind howled around him, a mournful sound that echoed the growing despair in his heart. He was alone, he realized, utterly and completely alone. And the truth, whatever it was out there, somewhere in the vast and indifferent expanse of the North Sea. He just had to find it. He had to. The boy's image, wrapped in his coat, became an obsession, a constant reminder of the nagging feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. The rig's logbook was a thick, leather-bound volume, its pages filled with the mundane details of daily operations. Owen sat hunched over the heavy book, the dim light of the crew quarters casting long shadows across the table. His fingers traced the neat rows of entries, searching for any mention of the supply boat, for any record of the boy. He found the entry for the boat's arrival, a brief notation of its name, the date, and the time. He compared it to the departure entry, a similarly terse record. Something felt off. The departure time seemed too early, hours earlier than he remembered seeing the boat disappear over the horizon. He checked the previous day's log, then the day before that, meticulously comparing the arrival and departure times of other supply boats. A pattern emerged, a subtle discrepancy in the timings, a consistent underreporting of the duration of the supply boat visits. He closed the logbook, his mind racing. Why would the rig logs be falsified? What were they trying to hide? He thought about the boy, his pale face, his fearful eyes. He thought about the whispers he'd heard during his dive, the crew's evasive answers, Grant Vance's pointed suspicion. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, forming a disturbing picture. He found Grant Vance in the mess hall, hunched over a plate of lukewarm stew. He approached him cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. "Grant," he said, his voice low. "I need to talk to you." Grant looked up, his eyes narrowed. "About what, Hawthorne?" "About the boy," Owen said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About the supply boat." Grant's jaw tightened. "I told you, Hawthorne, it's none of your business. Let it go." "I can't let it go," Owen insisted, his voice rising. "Something's not right. The logbook, the timings are off. They're lying about when the boat left." Grant pushed his plate away, his gaze hardening. "You're imagining things, Hawthorne. You've been working too hard. You need some rest." "I'm not imagining things," Owen retorted, his voice shaking with frustration. "I saw the boy. I talked to him. I gave him my coat." A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, or something darker, crossed Grant's face. "You're obsessed with this, Hawthorne," he said, his voice low and menacing. "It's not healthy. You remember what happened last time, don't you? On the Peterson platform?" Owen's breath caught in his throat. The Peterson platform. A wave of nausea washed over him, a visceral memory of panic, confusion, and the cold, sterile walls of the rig's infirmary. He'd been working there 2 years ago, a different rig, a different crew, but the same gnawing sense of paranoia, the same unshakable conviction that something was wrong. It had culminated in a breakdown, a complete disconnect from reality. They'd sedated him, confined him, sent him back to shore for evaluation. He tried to forget about it, to bury the memory of his instability, to convince himself it was a one-time incident, a temporary lapse in judgment brought on by stress and isolation. But now, Grant's words brought it all back, the fear, the confusion, the chilling realization that his own mind had betrayed him. "That was different," Owen stammered, his voice weak. "Was it?" Grant asked, his eyes boring into him. "Or are you just repeating the same pattern? Seeing things that aren't there, hearing voices, making accusations?" Owen opened his mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. He could see the doubt in Grant's eyes, the suspicion, the unspoken accusation. He could see it reflected in the faces of the other crew members, the whispers turning into stares, the unease into open hostility. He was losing them, losing their trust, losing his grip on reality. He turned and stumbled away, the weight of Grant's words pressing down on him like a physical burden. He felt the familiar panic rising in his chest, the same disorienting sensation he'd experienced on the Peterson platform. He was trapped, he realized, trapped in a cycle of paranoia and delusion, a cycle that was spiraling out of control. He retreated to his quarters, the small, cramped space offering little comfort. He sat on the edge of his bunk, his head in his hands, the whispers echoing in his mind. Grant was right, he thought, a chilling certainty settling over him. He was losing it. He was repeating the same mistakes, falling into the same patterns of self-destruction. The boy, the coat, the missing supply boat, they were all figments of his imagination, products of his fractured mind. But then another thought, a flicker of defiance, ignited in his mind. What if he wasn't imagining things? What if Grant and the rest of the crew were trying to gaslight him, to make him doubt his own sanity? What if they were the ones hiding something sinister, something connected to the boy in the missing boat? He looked up, his gaze settling on the heavy work coat hanging on the back of his door. It was still damp from the sea air, the faint smell of salt clinging to the fabric. He reached out and touched the rough material, a shiver running down his spine. The coat was real, he thought, a tangible reminder of the boy, of the fear in his eyes, of the strange compulsion he'd felt to help him. The boy was real. He had to be. And he, Owen Hawthorne, would find out what happened to him, no matter the cost. Even if it meant facing his own demons, even if it meant confronting the growing suspicion that he was losing his mind. The metal ladder rungs were cold against Owen's bare hands. He descended into the lower decks of the rig, the air growing thicker, heavier with the smell of diesel and sweat. He was looking for the boy's locker. He didn't know why, didn't know what he expected to find, but a deep-seated instinct, a primal urge, compelled him forward. He'd learned from one of the deckhands, a young kid named Finnegan, that the crew from the supply boats sometimes used spare lockers on the lower decks to store their personal belongings during their brief stays on the rig. Finnegan had been hesitant to share the information, his eyes darting nervously around as if he were divulging a classified secret. His reluctance, his evident unease, only strengthened Owen's conviction that something was being hidden. He found the lockers in a dimly lit corridor, a row of identical metal boxes lining the bulkhead. Most were locked, their surfaces scarred with rust and salt spray. He tried a few handles, hoping to find one left unlocked, but they were all securely fastened. He ran his hand along the cold metal, the rough texture a stark contrast to the imagined softness of the boy's small hand clutching his coat. Then he saw it. One locker, near the end of the row, stood slightly ajar. The metal door, dented and scratched, hung open at a crooked angle, revealing the empty space within. He peered inside, his heart pounding against his ribs. The locker was bare. No clothes, no personal belongings, no trace of the boy who had sought refuge within its confines. He reached inside, his fingers brushing against the cold metal walls. Empty. Utterly and completely empty. A hollow ache formed in his chest, a sense of emptiness that mirrored the vacant space before him. He closed the locker door, the metallic clang echoing in the confined space. He stood there for a moment, his mind reeling. The empty locker was a stark confirmation of his fears. The boy was gone, vanished, and the crew, he was now certain, were complicit in his disappearance. He replayed the events of the past few days in his mind, searching for answers, for clues. The boy's arrival, his fear, the way he'd clutched the coat. The crew's evasive answers, their hushed conversations, their careful scrutiny. Grant Vance's suspicion, his veiled threats, his pointed reminder of Owen's past instability. The missing supply boat, the falsified logbook, the whispers he'd heard during his dive. It all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. They were hiding something. They were protecting a secret that involved the boy and his disappearance. And they were using his past, his vulnerability, to discredit him, to make him doubt his own sanity. He thought about the superintendent's dismissal of his concerns, the deckhand's feigned ignorance, Grant Vance's menacing words. They were all part of it, he realized, a tightly knit conspiracy, a web of lies and deception designed to silence him, to keep him from uncovering the truth. He turned and walked back up the ladder, his mind racing, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. He would not be silenced. He would not be intimidated. He would uncover the truth no matter the cost. He owed it to the boy, the shivering child who had looked at him with such trust, such vulnerability. He owed it to himself, to his own sanity, to prove that he wasn't losing his mind, that he wasn't repeating the same mistakes that had led to his breakdown on the Peterson platform. He emerged onto the main deck, the wind whipping his hair across his face. He scanned the faces of the crew members, their movements now taking on a sinister quality, their smiles seeming forced, their greetings laced with a veiled hostility. He saw them for what they were, he thought. Conspirators, liars, accomplices in a crime he had yet to fully understand. He walked towards the bridge, his steps firm, his purpose clear. He would confront the superintendent, he would demand answers, he would expose their lies. He had nothing left to lose. He was already teetering on the edge of the abyss, and the only way to save himself was to jump. The rig superintendent, Peterson, sat behind his desk, a mountain of paperwork piled before him. He looked up as Owen entered, his expression a mixture of annoyance and weariness. "Hawthorne," he said, his voice flat. "What is it now?" "I know what you're doing," Owen said, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "I know about the boy. I know about the supply boat. I know you're lying." Peterson sighed, rubbing his temples with his fingers. "Hawthorne, I've already told you the boat left as scheduled. There's nothing to hide." "Don't lie to me," Owen snapped, his voice rising. "I checked the logbook. The timings are off. You falsified the records. You're covering something up." Peterson leaned back in his chair, his gaze hardening. "Hawthorne, you're starting to sound paranoid. This obsession with the boy, it's not healthy. You need to take a step back, get some rest." "Paranoid?" Owen repeated, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Is that what you're calling it? Paranoid? I saw the boy, Peterson. I talked to him. I gave him my coat. And now he's gone. Vanished. Along with the supply boat. And you expect me to believe it's just a coincidence?" Peterson stood up, his face flushed with anger. "Hawthorne, that's enough. I've had enough of your accusations. You're disrupting the operation of this rig. You're creating unrest among the crew. You need to calm down or I'll have to take action." "Action?" Owen challenged, stepping closer to the desk. "What kind of action, Peterson? Are you going to lock me up? Sedate me? Like they did on the Peterson platform?" Peterson's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "How did you know about that?" he asked, his voice low. "It doesn't matter," Owen said, his voice shaking with rage. "It's the same pattern, isn't it? You're all the same. You try to silence anyone who gets too close to the truth. You try to make them doubt their own sanity." He leaned closer, his face inches from Peterson's. "Where is he, Peterson?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "Where is the boy?" Peterson took a step back, his hand reaching for the phone on his desk. "Hawthorne, I'm warning you. Calm down." "Calm down?" Owen repeated, his voice rising to a shout. "How can I calm down when you're lying to my face? When you're covering up the disappearance of a child?" He slammed his fist on the desk, the force of the blow sending the papers scattering across the floor. "Tell me the truth, Peterson," he roared. "What did you do with him?" Peterson's face paled, his hand trembling as he reached for the phone. He pressed a button, his voice shaking as he spoke into the receiver. "Security to the bridge. Code 3. Code 3. Owen lunged forward, grabbing Peterson by the collar, his knuckles white with rage. "Tell me," he screamed, his voice echoing through the small office. "Tell me where he is." The door burst open and two security guards rushed in, their faces grim. They grabbed Owen's arms, pulling him away from Peterson. He struggled against their grip, his body shaking with fury, his mind consumed by a single overwhelming thought. He had to find the boy. He had to know what they had done to him. The security guards wrestled him to the ground, their weight pressing down on him, their hands restraining his flailing limbs. He felt a sharp prick in his arm, a burning sensation spreading through his veins. His vision blurred, his body went limp, and the world around him faded into a swirling vortex of darkness. He heard Peterson's voice, distant and distorted, as if coming from the bottom of a well. "Sedate him," he said, his tone cold and detached. "And confine him to the infirmary. Until we can figure out what to do with him." The last thing Owen saw before darkness consumed him was Grant Vance standing in the doorway, his arms crossed, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. The look in his eyes, a mixture of pity and contempt, sent a shiver down Owen's spine. He knew with a chilling certainty that he was trapped, caught in a web of lies and deception, a web from which there seemed no escape. The boy's face, pale and frightened, flashed before his eyes, a silent accusation, a haunting reminder of the truth he was desperately trying to uncover. The world swam back into focus, a blurry, distorted landscape of muted colors and muffled sounds. Owen's head throbbed, a dull, persistent ache that pulsed in time with his sluggish heartbeat. He blinked, his eyelids heavy, his vision gradually clearing. He was lying on a narrow bunk, the thin mattress offering little comfort against the cold metal frame. The air was thick with the antiseptic smell of the Riggs infirmary, a scent he now associated with fear and failure. He tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over him, forcing him back down. He closed his eyes, his mind a jumble of fragmented memories and disjointed thoughts. He remembered the confrontation with Peterson, the surge of anger, the struggle with the security guards. He remembered the prick in his arm, the burning sensation, the descent into darkness. He remembered the boy, the coat, the missing supply boat. But the details were hazy, elusive, like trying to grasp smoke. He opened his eyes again, focusing on the white walls of the infirmary, the sterile environment a stark contrast to the chaotic turmoil in his mind. He tried to piece together the events of the past few days, but his memories were fractured, unreliable. He remembered snatches of conversations, glimpses of faces, fleeting impressions of fear and suspicion. But they were disconnected, out of sequence, like pieces of a shattered mirror reflecting distorted images of reality. He saw the boy's face, pale and frightened, his eyes wide with a terror Owen couldn't comprehend. He saw the coat, its rough fabric engulfing the boy's small frame, a symbol of warmth and protection that now seemed tainted with menace. He saw Grant Vance's face, his eyes narrowed with suspicion, his lips curled into a sneer. He saw Peterson's face, flushed with anger, his voice cold and dismissive. He saw the faces of the other crew members, their expressions shifting, their glances furtive, their words veiled in secrecy. But the images were fleeting, ephemeral, dissolving into the fog of his drugged mind. He couldn't hold on to them, couldn't make sense of them. He felt like he was drowning in a sea of confusion, his memories slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. He heard a creak of the door and he turned his head, his vision still blurry. Grant Vance stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the narrow opening. He approached the bunk, his expression unreadable. "How are you feeling, Hawthorne?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Owen stared at him, his mind struggling to process the question. He felt a surge of suspicion, a deep-seated distrust that lingered beneath the fog of the sedatives. "What did you do to me?" he asked, his voice raspy. Grant sighed, pulling up a chair and sitting down beside the bunk. "We gave you something to calm you down," he said. "You were having a difficult time." "A difficult time?" Owen repeated, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Is that what you're calling it? A difficult time? I was trying to tell you the truth. I was trying to find out what happened to the boy." Grant's expression softened, a hint of pity in his eyes. "There was no boy, Owen," he said quietly. "There never was." Owen stared at him, his mind reeling. "What are you talking about?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I saw him. I talked to him. I gave him my coat." Grant reached out and placed a hand on Owen's arm, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You were hallucinating, Owen," he said softly. "It's the stress, the isolation. It happens sometimes out here. You were imagining things." He paused, his gaze searching Owen's face. "The coat you gave to the boy, it was your own coat, Owen. You'd forgotten you were wearing it. We were all worried about you. You haven't been yourself lately." Owen's mind struggled to grasp the words, to reconcile them with the fragmented memories swirling in his head. He looked down at himself, his body covered by a thin hospital blanket. He felt a sudden chill, a sense of emptiness where the weight of his coat should have been. He looked back at Grant, his eyes searching for a flicker of deception, a hint of the conspiracy he was convinced existed. But there was nothing. Only concern and a deep, unsettling pity. He closed his eyes, the fog of the sedatives pulling him back into the darkness. He couldn't make sense of it, couldn't reconcile Grant's words with the vivid, albeit fragmented, memories of the boy, the coat, the missing supply boat. He felt lost, adrift in a sea of doubt and confusion, unsure of what was real and what was a product of his own fractured mind. He wanted to believe Grant, to accept his explanation, to embrace the comforting notion that it had all been a hallucination, a temporary lapse in sanity. But a nagging doubt, a persistent whisper of unease, lingered in the back of his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that something was still being hidden, something sinister and terrifying. He opened his eyes again, his gaze settling on Grant's face. "I don't remember," he whispered, his voice weak and uncertain. "I don't remember putting on my coat." Grant nodded, his expression sympathetic. "It's okay, Owen," he said softly. "Just try to rest. We'll talk more later." He stood up and turned to leave, his shadow stretching across the infirmary floor. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back at Owen, his gaze lingering for a moment before he disappeared into the corridor. Owen lay back on the bunk, his mind a swirling vortex of doubt and confusion. He was alone again, trapped in the sterile confines of the infirmary, the fog of memory obscuring the truth, the whispers of paranoia still echoing in his mind. He didn't know what to believe, who to trust. He didn't even trust himself. The sedative's grip loosened its hold on Owen's mind, leaving him in a state of fragile lucidity. The disorientation remained, a subtle swaying sensation as if the rig itself were still rocking beneath him. He pushed himself up, the movement sluggish and deliberate. The infirmary was empty, bathed in the pale light filtering through a small porthole. He swung his legs over the edge of the bunk, the cold metal floor a shock against his bare feet. He stood, swaying slightly, and took a tentative step, then another. He was weak, his muscles atrophied from days of confinement, but he felt a growing sense of urgency, a need to escape the sterile confines of the infirmary, to breathe fresh air, to see the world beyond the rig's metal walls. He made his way to the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. It turned easily, and he stepped out into the corridor, the familiar smells of diesel and salt air a welcome assault on his senses. He walked slowly, his legs still unsteady, his mind still clouded by the lingering effects of the drugs. He passed crew members, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern, their greetings hesitant, their glances furtive. He nodded in acknowledgement but didn't stop, driven by a primal need to reach the outside deck, to see the sea, to feel the wind on his face. He emerged onto the main deck, blinking against the bright sunlight. The North Sea stretched out before him, a vast expanse of shimmering blue under a clear sky. The wind, a gentle caress compared to the biting chill he remembered, ruffled his hair, carrying the familiar scent of salt and seaweed. He walked towards the railing, drawn by the hypnotic rhythm of the waves lapping against the rig's steel legs. He leaned against the metal, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his mind slowly beginning to clear. He looked down at himself, noticing for the first time that he was wearing his heavy work coat. The rough fabric felt familiar against his skin, the weight a comforting presence. He ran his hand over the worn material, a faint memory stirring in the back of his mind. He remembered giving his coat to the boy, the shivering child with the wide, frightened eyes. He remembered the strange compulsion he'd felt to help him, the warmth spreading through his chest as he'd watched the boy disappear into the oversized garment. He looked out at the sea again, his gaze scanning the horizon, searching for any sign of the missing supply boat. But there was nothing. Just the endless expanse of blue, stretching out to meet the sky. He closed his eyes, his mind replaying the events of the past few days. The boy's arrival, his fear, the way he'd clutched the coat. The crew's evasive answers, their hushed conversations, their careful scrutiny. Grant Vance's suspicion, his veiled threats, his pointed reminder of Owen's past instability. The missing supply boat, the falsified logbook, the whispers he'd heard during his dive. He opened his eyes again, his gaze settling on the calm surface of the water. He saw his reflection staring back at him, a distorted image shimmering in the gentle waves. He was wearing his work coat, his heavy, thick work coat. He reached up and touched the collar, the rough fabric a stark reality against his fingertips. He looked at his reflection again, a flicker of understanding dawning in his eyes. He was wearing his coat. He had been wearing it the whole time. A wave of nausea washed over him, a sickening realization rising in his chest. There had been no boy, no missing supply boat, no conspiracy. It had all been in his head. A hallucination, a delusion, a product of his own fractured mind. He remembered Grant's words in the infirmary, his gentle voice, his pitying gaze. There was no boy, Owen. There never was. The coat you gave to the boy, it was your own coat, Owen. You'd forgotten you were wearing it. He had projected his own childhood trauma, his own deep-seated fears of abandonment and isolation, onto a figment of his imagination. He had created the boy, the missing boat, the conspiracy, all in an attempt to make sense of the overwhelming stress and paranoia he'd been experiencing. He looked at his reflection again, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a dawning horror. He saw the truth reflected in the calm surface of the water, a truth he had been desperately trying to deny. He was sick. He was broken. He was repeating the same patterns of self-destruction that had led to his breakdown on the Peterson platform. He heard footsteps approaching, and he turned to see Grant Vance standing behind him, his expression a mixture of concern and relief. "Owen," he said softly, "how are you feeling?" Owen stared at him, the weight of his delusion pressing down on him like a physical burden. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He could only shake his head, a silent acknowledgement of his own fractured reality. Grant stepped closer, his hand resting gently on Owen's shoulder. "It's okay, Owen," he said, his voice soothing. "We're here for you. We'll get through this together." Owen looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and gratitude. He knew Grant was right. He needed help. He needed to face his demons, to confront the darkness that lurked within his own mind. He needed to accept the truth, no matter how painful, no matter how terrifying. He looked out at the sea again, the vast expanse of blue now a symbol of the unknown, the vastness of his own inner turmoil. He took a deep breath, the salty air filling his lungs, a small measure of comfort in the face of the daunting task ahead. He had a long journey ahead of him, a journey into the depths of his own fractured mind. But he wasn't alone. He had Grant and the rest of the crew, and perhaps, with their help, he could find his way back from the edge of the abyss. He looked down at his coat, the rough fabric a reminder of the delusion he had created, a tangible symbol of the fragility of his own mind. The harbor's reaction, the speechless bewilderment, had not been directed at the boy. It had been directed at him. At Owen Hawthorne, the man who had offered his own coat to a shivering boy who never existed.